our lives, afraid of death. But what's more horrible? A loss of existence when our lives blink out, or a continued existence as a parody of life? Mummies who return from dormancy amidst the dust of the tomb. Frankenstein's creature, culled from several dead. Zombies who rise from their graves to decimate humanity, slaves to their impulses. The reanimated dead threaten to, at the very least, destroy us, and, at the very worst, change us into mindless, raving versions of our former selves. For the undead are some of the worst monsters among us. Mankind, in an effort to understand its own mortality, has created an afterlife, a belief in the great beyond, and a refusal to believe that we cease to exist after our mortal shells die. One of the greatest afterlife myths belongs to the ancient Egyptians, with their tale of Osiris, the god of the dead. One such documentation, beyond the painted murals on pyramid walls, comes from Greek historian Plutarch.
The animal-headed god of chaos, Set, is jealous of his brother Osiris and prepares a death trap for the king. Secretly having measured Osiris, Set prepares a wooden sarcophagus as a centerpiece at a party. Each partygoer tries and fails to fit in. And when Osiris successfully fits, Set seals the coffin with lead and hurls his entrapped brother into the Nile. Isis, Osiris' wife, scared the improper burial will prevent Osiris from the afterlife, finds his coffin embedded in the trunk of a cedar tree. She leaves it to rest in a marshland, where the vengeful Set stumbles upon it. Dismembering Osiris' body into 14 pieces, Set scatters them throughout Egypt. Isis succeeds in finding 13 of the pieces, all but the sex organ, which she replaces with a phallus made of gold. Keeping watch over his reassembled body, Isis sings him back to life. Osiris' new position as the king of the afterlife, where he observes the judgment of the recently dead.
In the Bible, Ezekiel 37. In the valley of the dry bones, Ezekiel has a vision of Israel's rebirth. God breathes life into a valley of bones, much in the same way he had first breathed life into Adam. The bones assemble themselves into skeletons, flesh is knit over, and an army of the living dead stand together in force. Moving forward hundreds of years, we find the reanimated dead more than just a myth, but a cold, stark reality. The greatest example of the living dead comes from a Caribbean state not much older than the United States. Bela Lugosi, of Dracula fame, stars in 1932's horror film White Zombie as a white bokor who uses his powers to turn an innocent woman into a zombie. This first feature-length film adds the letter E to the end of the traditional spelling of zombie, which will become the normal spelling of zombie in the Western world. A sequel of sorts, Revolt of the Zombies, follows in 1936. The zombie and voodoo scourge is also dealt with in 1943's I Walked with a Zombie. Yet, these mindless characters, enslaved by Hollywoodized bokors, fail to capture the public's imagination or terror. But the greatest of the walking dead had already been created, from both the alchemy of a stormy night and the fears of Victorian Europe. we return to that night in 1816 at Villa Diodati, sitting by Lake Geneva. The poet, Lord Byron, reads German ghost stories to his guests, including Mary Wollstonecraft, her half-sister Claire, physician John Polidori, and the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. Byron's challenge to create the scariest ghost story is taken seriously by Mary, who is herself the scion of two philosophers and a feminist in her own right.
I busied myself to think of a story to rival those which had excited us to this task, one which would speak to the mysterious fears of our nature and awaken thrilling horror.
The story conjured in Mary's dreams is itself born of the fear of a reanimated dead and, quite possibly, her encounter with the tales of a historical scientist once bent on creating new life and a place visited on her honeymoon. When Mary's father, William Godwin, forbids her and her love, Percy Bysshe Shelley, to marry in 1814, they elope with Claire in tow and take a tour of Europe with little money and no set destination in mind. One of their stops is in the German town of Gersheim on September 2nd, where they likely come across an old castle atop a hill. Overlooking the land below, the castle was built in the 1300s, the land having been in possession of the warrior Franks since 948 AD. As the Franks build their castle near a former Roman quarry, the clan becomes known as Stone of the Franks, or Frankenstein. The Frankensteins were of a warrior lineage. In 1430, one member once battles one of the most feared and savage warriors in all of Europe, Vlad the Impaler himself. The results are lost to history. Legend is that Sir George von Frankenstein slays a dragon with his sword in the 1500s. The beast strikes back with the stinger on its tail and fatally poisons the brave knight. Another legend starts out of Castle Frankenstein on August 10th, 1673, with the birth of Joseph Conrad Dippel. The mercurial Dippel becomes known for verbally abusing his contenders and dueling with them in the streets. In Strasbourg, he flees the city after killing a man. Dippel does not find a keen interest in theology, as his Lutheran clergyman father once, nor does he become ensconced in the medical sciences, but somewhere in between. Dippel embraces alchemy, the study of transmutation, and turns to transforming base metals into valuable ones, such as gold. To this end, and determined to find the mythical philosopher's stone and elixir of life, Dippel outfits an alchemical laboratory. Soon, rumors abound that Dippel is practicing the black arts and digging graves for cadavers to experiment on. Dippel apparently does find the ability to create gold, but it is lost forever in a ruinous laboratory fire. What Dippel does attain, however, is an elixir called Dippel's Oil that at least includes blood, distilled animal bones. How they are attained, only the dead know. Mary would also be aware of Giovanni Aldini, an Italian scientist born in 1762, who later migrated to England. Aldini's uncle Luigi Galvani's theories of applying electricity to reanimate dead animals formed the basis of his own mission to bring the dead back through animal electricity. In January 1802, Aldini gives a demonstration of his electrical arc, a pincer-like contraption with a current of energy running through, to reanimate an ox's head. As energy courses through, its tongue wags, and the rest of the head moves about as if in life. On occasion, Aldini overdoes the current, and the eyes begin to pop from the sockets, or the head explodes. Later that month, Aldini is given the bodies of 2 convicts, both executed, to experiment on. Spectators enter the medical arena to see the entire bottom half of one convict's body on an operating table and the head of the second on another.
On the first application of the process to the face, the jaws of the deceased criminal began to quiver, and the adjoining muscles were horribly contorted, and one eye was actually open. In the subsequent part of the process, the right hand was raised and clenched, and the legs and thighs were set in motion.
A year later, the culmination of Aldini's theory on resuscitating life is put to the test when he procures the body of a convict. George Forster had been found guilty of drowning both his wife and daughter and was hanged shortly thereafter. The body is procured the customary hour after death. Electrodes are placed all over the body, from the limbs to the face. Aldini cuts the current on and applies his arc. Forster's heart still refuses to beat. Desperate, Aldini cracks the ribs and exposes the heart. He places the arc near the heart and zaps it. It still fails to beat. The experiment is a failure. This world, where reanimating the dead seems a distinct possibility, is the world of Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. On the night of June 22nd, these things boil to the surface of her mind as Shelley and Byron discuss science. Her thoughts turn to galvanism and then to something far more disturbing.
Perhaps the component parts of a creature might be manufactured, brought together, and endued with vital warmth. I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life, and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. Frightful must it be, for supremely frightful would be the effect of any human endeavour to mock the stupendous mechanism of the Creator of the world.
Mary eventually expands her short story into a novel. By May 1817, she puts the finishing touches on the modern Prometheus, or, as it is better known, Frankenstein. Brilliant young medical student Victor Frankenstein, inspired by alchemy, is obsessed with creating a human being from the body parts of the dead. Terror sinks in when his dream changes to a nightmarish reality. Little does Victor Frankenstein know what he is releasing upon the world with the birth of his nameless creature. His creature soon learns the truth about humanity as he is shunned for his monstrous appearance. As the creature's intelligence grows, so does his anger.
Accursed creator, why did you form a monster so hideous that even you turned from me in disgust? God, in pity, made man beautiful and alluring after his own image. But my form is a filthy type of yours, more horrid even from the very resemblance. Satan had his companions, fellow devils, to admire and encourage him, but I am solitary and abhorred.
The creature comes to Frankenstein with a proposition: create a partner for him, or suffer the loss of those he loves most. It is Frankenstein's 11th hour rejection of this proposal that stirs the creature's vengeance even further and leads it to murder his creator's new wife. Frankenstein pursues his creation to the Arctic, where he is brought aboard a ship bound for the North Pole. The weary Frankenstein dies after realizing the folly of his playing God. His creature admits defeat upon the death of his maker.
But soon I shall die, and what I now feel be no longer felt. Soon these burning miseries will be extinct. I shall ascend my funeral pile triumphantly and exult in the agony of the torturing flames. The light of that conflagration will fade away. My ashes will be swept into the sea by the winds. My spirit will sleep in peace, or if it thinks, it will not surely think thus. Farewell.
Initially published anonymously in 1818, only 500 copies are printed in the first edition, earning Mary about £28 in royalties. Percy Bysshe Shelley dies in a boating accident in 1822. Mary leaves Italy and returns to London the next year. Little could she know the influence of her work, including the theatrical adaptation, Presumption, or The Fate of Frankenstein, by Richard Brinsley Peake at the English Opera House in the Strand. The most radical change to Mary's novel is with the creature himself, as he is now rendered mute. It will become one of the character's defining traits in most subsequent adaptations. Nearly 100 separate stage adaptations will follow over time. Mary Shelley outlives her husband and Polidori, as well as 3 of her 4 children. She writes more novels, but none attain the immortality of Frankenstein. She dies on February 1st, 1851, of a brain tumor at 53.
One of the most interesting things to me about the Frankenstein story is the fact that it's stuck around. And essentially, it is a tale that was created by Mary Shelley with a few inspirations for it, but generally speaking, there are not a lot of tales like this before her time. And this, of course, is what she's known for and has been known for. But when we think of Frankenstein, we generally think not of her story, but of the classic universal Boris Karloff rendition with the flat top head and the bolts coming out of the neck. As I said, I think the fact that it's stuck around is very, very important. I've always sort of seen it personally as a metaphor for creativity. In and of itself, people who make a life out of being creative have a sort of love-hate relationship with what they do. They make something with the best of intentions. They want it to be perfect. They invest their soul in it. They literally call their artwork a baby. Or, and this could be, an engineer. It could be anybody who's making something. And you have a vision of perfection. And then what you find is that the thing has a life of its own, and you don't necessarily, you're not necessarily prepared for that when something that you're creating and you think of as your child in a sense has its own identity and its own needs and its own personality. So part of the appeal, I think, of Frankenstein as a story is the fact that we can all relate to the desire to create. We can all relate to the act of creation and the fact that we can't really control it.
Frankenstein and his creation live on in the new film medium, starting with an adaptation by Thomas Edison's film studio. The 16-minute movie is shot in 3 days at Edison Studios in the Bronx, New York City. The film's claim to be a liberal adaptation is apt. While Frankenstein follows the basic plot of Shelley's novel, condensed into 12 minutes, it is a magical take on the scientific original. The monster is created in a cauldron and disappears when overwhelmed by the love between Frankenstein and Elizabeth on their wedding night. While Lugosi is announced to play the creature in 1930, the Hungarian actor ultimately declines the role. Taken by Karloff's distinctive features, director James Whale screen tests Karloff. he instantly finds Frankenstein's creature. The British-born Karloff is 44 when he takes the role, having struggled as an actor since 1909. To support his acting, he has worked as everything from a truck driver to manual laborer. The intensive work leaves him with a lifetime of back problems. Wales' Frankenstein, based on Webling's play, is an atmospheric triumph. The angles of the set design evoke a constant sense of foreboding. The Millhouse setting for Frankenstein's laboratory is composed of uneven brick walls that spiral up the imperfect center and ominously catch the light. It is a canvas that captures Karloff's imposing shadow. The true centerpiece of the film is Karloff's performance. Even at his most physically terrifying, he gives the creature a childlike emotional vulnerability that audiences connect with. Universal, originally billing Karloff as no more than a question mark, is quick to capitalize on its star.
Universal Studios had a very, very young president of the company who was very, very into monsters and stuff. And once he got in there and it was his turn to start greenlighting productions, he immediately started filling the 1930s with amazing monster movies, starting with Dracula. And Dracula was such a hit, they brought Lugosi from the stage production to do Dracula, and it was huge. And so immediately they followed, this was 1931, immediately they followed it up with an adaptation of Frankenstein, also more based off of the play than Mary Shelley's book. And it was another huge hit. It was originally offered to Lugosi, but since it didn't have much in the way of speaking roles and it wasn't a sexy part, Lugosi turned it down. And Boris Karloff, who was in his 40s at the time, really thought he was at the end of his career, ended up taking on the role. And it was really under a lot of makeup, and you know, the guy had a lot of back problems, and a lot of that, I think, he didn't have, you know, he took out his false teeth, a lot of his own, I think, physical ailments just from being an older gentleman for the day, because a guy in his 40s today is still an adolescent.
His next major horror role is as another member of the reanimated dead, but this one with little literary precedent. Universal producer Carl Lammle, Jr., inspired by the opening of King Tut's tomb in 1922, wants an Egyptian-themed horror movie to succeed Dracula and Frankenstein. There had been no major literary works on Egyptian mummies, save for short stories by none less than Edgar Allan Poe and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. When Edgar Allan Poe writes Some Words with a Mummy in 1845, it is not a horror story from the master of the supernatural, but a satire of the period's Egypt mania craze. The story's narrator is an aspiring scholar of Egyptology who is already well drunk by the start. When an Egyptian mummy is unwrapped by his friends and a Dr. Ponener, they find the corpse of one Ala Mistacchio. It isn't until current is run through the mummy's nose that he comes to life and berates the party. As the evening goes on, the party debates their societies with the mummy, with ancient Egypt trumping modern man's. Until there is one thing Ala Mistacchio cannot challenge, the advance of snake oil remedies, such as Ponener's lozenges or Brandreth's pills.
The Egyptian blushed and hung down his head. Never was triumph so consummate. Never was defeat born with so ill a grace. Indeed, I could not endure the spectacle of our poor mummy's mortification. I reached my hat, bowed to him stiffly, and took my leave. Upon getting home, I found it past 4 o'clock, and went immediately to bed. It is now 10 a.m. I have been up since 7, penning these memoranda for the benefit of my family and of mankind. The former I shall behold no more. My wife is a shrew. The truth is, I am heartily sick of life and the 19th century in general. I am convinced that everything is going wrong. Besides, I'm anxious to know who will be the president in 2045. As soon, therefore, as I shave and swallow a cup of coffee, I shall just step over to Pioneers and get embalmed for a couple 100 years.
Some Words with a Mummy is one of Poe's stories about Egyptomania, this fascination that Westerners had with Egypt after Napoleon and the French brought back mummies and Egyptian artifacts. So Europe and America were Egypt crazy during Poe's time, and even in 1823, when Poe was 14 years old, there was a mummy on display in the Virginia State Capitol. So people, including Poe himself, would get to go and see the mummy, and the fascination got so great that they even designed an Egyptian temple in Richmond called the Egyptian Building as their first medical school in the city. So Poe was coming at the story from that angle, and his story is about a mummy unwrapping party. And in that time, people would host mummy unwrapping parties. They would invite their friends, and just like the name says, they would unwrap a mummy. And in this story, a group of scientists decided while they're at it, they should see what happens if they shock the mummy with an electric battery, and the mummy came to life.
Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, famed for his creation of Sherlock Holmes, writes his own mummy story in 1890. The Ring of Thoth is about the ancient Egyptian Sosra, cursed with being unable to die so as to be reunited with his love in the afterlife. The imagery in it of the dry-skinned, wrinkled Egyptian will become the basis for the Mummy's movie debut.
There was something inhuman and preternatural about its appearance. Over the temple and cheekbone it was as glazed and as shiny as varnished parchment. There was no suggestion of pores. One could not fancy a drop of moisture upon that arid surface. From brow to chin, however, it was cross-hatched by 1,000,000 delicate wrinkles, which shot and interlaced as though nature, in some Maori mood, had tried how wild and intricate a pattern she could devise.
For Sosra, the goal was in his death to join hers in the afterlife. Elements of the story will find their way to the big screen in Universal's The Mummy. Director Karl Freund creates a quiet and moody film with several moments that are punctuated with frightening ones. Karloff's portrayal as the mummy, Imhotep, is both sinister and sexually charged as he pursues the reincarnation of his long-dead love. While The Mummy is a success, it still takes 8 years for another film to be made, The Mummy's Hand. This one is not a follow-up, but a remake, featuring the mummy of another Egyptian priest, Charis, played by silent film cowboy Tom Tyler. 3 more mummy movies follow, this time starring Lon Chaney Jr. as the mummy. The son of screen legend Lon Chaney, the man of 1,000 faces, his greatest success will soon come through another Universal series, The Wolfman. As for Karloff, he returns to the Frankenstein's creature makeup for The Bride of Frankenstein in 1935. Borrowing more elements from Shelley's novel, it features Elsa Lanchester as both Mary Shelley in a framing sequence that honors the Villa Diodati weekend, and as the iconic bride.
In the novel, there was a bride created by the Doctor, which was not in the first film. And so they went back and they sort of told that story. In the book, the monster demanded a mate, and at a certain point, supposedly, it was too disgusting of an idea for the Doctor to imagine these two characters, these two creations of his, physically mating, and disgusted him. So he destroyed the monster's mate, and in an act of revenge, the monster then destroys his own, the Doctor's family, Victor Frankenstein's family.
Karloff once more plays the creature for Son of Frankenstein in 1939. Hammer Films in England practically reinvents the horror film in the late 1950s and pushes beyond anything that had come before. They released their Frankenstein in 1957, starring Peter Cushing as Frankenstein and Christopher Lee as the creature. Unlike Universal, this series follows Frankenstein himself rather than his creation. Cushing and Lee also star in a 1959 version of The Mummy, which launches its own series of films. The Mummy, for a character with minimal literary origin, has become a member of the monster pantheon. After the advent of World War II, horror takes comic books by storm. Amongst the usual company of ghosts, vampires, and werewolves are the living dead. In 1942's Air Fighter Comics, publisher Hillman introduces a legendary reanimated corpse, but with a twist. When World War I German ace Baron Emmelmann crashes into the swamps of Poland, his body is thrown clear of the plane's cockpit. Over the years, his will to live merges with the vegetation around his dead body, and he emerges as the Heap. The Heap lumbers about the world until 1953. EC Comics, publishers of Tales from the Crypt, Vault of Horror, and Haunt of Fear, regularly feature the reanimated corpses of those murdered. And they always come back to settle the score. The horror genre is banned by an industry-wide censorship act called the Comics Code in 1954. But the comics have already affected countless baby boomers.
What we call monster kids, which are baby boomers who grew up reading comic books, collecting toys, and reading Famous Monsters magazine. The idea of being separate from everyone, not being misunderstood. The Frankenstein of the movies is very sympathetic to where there's always these sort of scenes where, he almost kind of holds it together, but then the human race kind of betrays him and he has to go crazy and just burn it all, knock it all down. And so I think there is something about Frankenstein that is that misunderstood monster fan. And I think that people identify themselves in that way. And I also think that those movies, Dracula, Frankenstein, the werewolf, they all kind of have a fairy tale type quality. Also the fact that they're geared toward a younger audience. I mean, this type of material was thought of as being kid stuff, matinee stuff. Monsters and horror movies weren't thought of as being real legitimate in that time. They were thought of as being exploitive and also being thought of as being fair for youngsters. And so in those days, and we're talking 30s, 40s, and 50s, it was really aimed at the kids. And so I think it does appeal to that part of us, the 10-year-old inside of us, going forward. In the 60s, they started making horror movies for teenagers because those kids grew up. And then they have the movie that you take your date to the drive-in or whatever. And then it became upping the ante and making them more horrific and more scarier and making the monsters less like fairy tale monsters where, it's the ogre with the big heart. It then becomes the threat. And I think a lot of that was fueled by a lot of our, we had a lot, the communists and other groups that we were terrified of that kind of filled in that blank of what those monsters represented. And we were no longer romancing being the monster, we were more romancing destroying the monster. I think the other thing that's really interesting about movies of the 50s and 60s versus the 30s and 40s is that in the 50s and 60s, science is kind of like our friend, I think because of the atomic bomb, there's this sort of like, we're the guys with the science. We want our kids to learn science. We want to romanticize being a scientist because we want a bunch of smart kids so we can beat the commies. you know. So I think that there was a lot of movies with heroes for scientists, you know, and monsters just being straight evil. Where in Frankenstein, it's definitely this, he tampered in God's domain. You know, that's sort of the lesson of the original Frankenstein story, and that science is kind of thought of as sort of a dark art, and scientists are thought of as being mad scientists. And Dr. Frankenstein is the quintessential mad scientist. Whereas in the 60s, you know, scientists were the guys with the pipe who figured stuff out. And so that kind of, in another way, created another romance with kids of the 60s wanting to grow up to be scientists. And, you know, they grew up and invented everything. And now we don't really have that focus in movies with scientists as heroes. So you got math scores dropping and people not wanting to be scientists. And so I'm sure some other country will just sweep us under the rug.
It is the mid-1960s, and commercial directors George Romero and Russell Striner self-fund, with help from a few friends, a horror movie for $114,000. The title is The Night of the Flesh Eaters. In stark black and white, Flesh Eaters follows the chaos when an airborne disease turns the world's unburied dead into brainless ghouls. Taking their final film to a distribution company, they changed the film's title because of an earlier film simply called The Flesh Eaters. They settle on a title that will go down in infamy: Night of the Living Dead. A handful of strangers are trapped together in a farmhouse as flesh eaters encroach upon them. As the film progresses, news broadcasts give the perspective of the outside world, and militias assemble to destroy armies of the ambling dead. While they aren't referred to as zombies directly within the film, Night of the Living Dead is considered the point from which the modern zombie emerges, using the flesh eaters as a mode of social criticism in the world of the Cold War. A new element is introduced to the Western zombie in 1985's Return of the Living Dead. Rather than just flesh, these zombies also crave human brains. As the American zombie takes root in the fears of viewers everywhere, the Haitian zombie still remains a mystery. That ignorance is brought to light with the story of Haitian Clairvius Narcisse, who returns home in 1980 after being dead for 18 years. Narcisse, aged 40, dies on April 30th, 1962, after admitting himself to the Albert Schweitzer Hospital in Deschapelles, Haiti. His lengthy illness culminates in his coughing up blood, and 2 days later, his death. But that is not all for Narcisse. As he lays underneath the sheet, his skin feels on fire, and he hears his sisters weeping. His coffin lid is hammered shut, and a nail projects through and cuts his face. Clairvius bears silent witness to it all, unable to move. Even as his coffin is dug up, the lid pried off, and a Bokor and his henchmen drag him out to beat him mercilessly, he is aware. When he comes to, everything is dreamlike. He's on a sugar plantation where he toils for 2 years. With 1 meal a day, Clairvius is sluggish. 2 years later, the Bokor begins beating a zombie as punishment. The zombie grabs a hoe and, in self-defense, kills the Bokor. The zombies, freed, leave the plantation. For 14 years, Clairvius wanders, awaiting a reply to letters sent to his family. Upon the death of his brother, whom Clairvius comes to suspect as the one to curse him to life as a zombie, does he return. In 1982, Canadian ethnobotanist and anthropologist Wade Davis travels to Haiti to finally uncover the truth behind zombies, starting with the case of Clairvius Narcisse. Gaining samples of the zombie powder used by Bokors to create their mindless slaves, Wade finds the 3 common ingredients in all: ground human bones, plants with urticating hairs, spines, resins or calcium crystals, sometimes with tarantula parts added. This causes scratches on the skin and allows the poison to spread into the bloodstream. Puffer fish toxin, containing tetrodotoxin. Puffer fish are amongst the deadliest known poisons and can cause paralysis, a blocking of the nervous system, and malaise, amongst other symptoms. Davis theorizes that the puffer fish is the most active ingredient in the zombie powder, and that the stupor-like effect after a zombie's disinterment is caused by regular feeding of the datura plant, also known as a zombie cucumber. It causes delirium and, in some cases, complete amnesia. The victim's belief that a Bokor can turn him into a zombie can also make the drug's effect that much more real for him. But is the Haitian zombie truly demystified? Perhaps in theory, yes. But in practice, let's pray we never find out firsthand. Danny Boyle and screenwriter Alex Garland bring new unlife to the zombie with 2002's 28 Days Later. A rabies-like infection spreads a raging virus throughout humanity and affects anyone brought in touch with infected blood. It is what surviving amidst the infected apocalypse does to the human psyche that is most terrifying. While 28 Days Later is arguably not a zombie movie, the infected are not undead, but simply mad, it sparks a new zombie craze. Writer Max Brooks pens the novel World War Z, an oral history of the zombie war, in 2003. For Brooks, the zombie outbreak is a vehicle for social commentary towards the America of post-9/11. Comic book writer Robert Kirkman, with artist Tony Moore, launches a black-and-white zombie comic, The Walking Dead, in 2003. It is adapted into a television show of the same name in 2010 and continues to infect a new legion of zombie fans. Zombie mania sweeps the U.S., and beyond just on Halloween. Zombie walks are organized to raise money for charity, with participants joining in as they are bitten by other zombies. The zombie has become a phenomenon that just won't die.
A lot of imagery comes to mind when you think of zombies. The mindless hordes of the undead sort of shuffling around, staggering, sometimes dragging their foot, which that's not zombie, those are mummies, okay? I don't know how zombies got the thing of dragging their foot. That actually comes from Boris Karloff's depiction of the mummy. But whenever you got a bunch of extras dressed as zombies in the movie, you always see like 7 guys dragging their leg around, because that imagery of that undead character kind of seeped into the zombie legend as well. And so there's this image, at least the original image of the zombie, where these was kind of fueled by this sort of West African slaves in the New World. And so when the movie White Zombie was made, you know, that was like, you know, a white zombie, whoa, that's crazy. You know, that was like turning it on its ear by taking something that was kind of thought of as Afro-American and having Bela Lugosi being a sort of Caucasian version of that, you know, because it was just exploitation, and you know, that was just a way to sort of take something that was, you know, in their culture and put it in our culture, and that was like, wait a second, we're not supposed to do stuff like that. So that's sort of a weird, you know, there's a lot of ways to look at that and not many ways to talk about it without sounding racist. But it's a very cool aspect of being able to control, like, I guess, you know, Bela Lugosi was kind of the Boker, and he was controlling these hordes of zombies in the film White Zombie. It struck such a chord with moviegoers where, you know, there are these people who just don't care, you know, you blow their arm off, they just keep walking at you, you know, they'll just walk right off a cliff, it'll just keep marching. And I think that, you know, that sort of enemy who you can't reason with, you can't talk to, they don't think the way we do, they don't even think at all. I think that's very terrifying for people, and I think throughout the years that figure has meant different things and has changed. In the film Night of the Living Dead, George A. Romero kind of used the zombie as a symbol of a sort of a social rebellion, you know, to where, you know, at a certain point the world doesn't belong to you anymore. It's been taken over right from underneath you, and you're the outsider.
Listen, I got a kid down there.
Well, you're her father. If you're stupid enough to go die in that trap, that's your business. However, I am not stupid enough to follow you. It is tough for the kid that her old man is so stupid. Now, you get the hell down in the cellar. You can be the boss down there. I'm boss up here.
And the world already belongs to somebody else. And they lifted that theme directly from The Last Man on Earth, the Matheson novel. And I think that that concept of this subversion being more powerful than rebellion, you know, to where it could happen without you really realizing it, and someone else has inherited the earth right from underneath you.
Reports, incredible as they seem, are not the results of mass hysteria. The wave of murder which is sweeping the eastern third of the nation is being committed by creatures who feast upon the flesh of their victims. First eyewitness accounts of this grisly development came from people who were understandably frightened and almost incoherent. Officials and newsmen at first discounted those eyewitness descriptions as being beyond belief.
This subversion being more powerful than rebellion, where it could happen without you really realizing it, and someone else has inherited the earth right from underneath you. I think that feeds into a lot of our fears about outsiders, about strangers, and I think it also, as we, in this technological world, you know, we kind of feel like we're losing ourselves. We're giving more and more of our human duties away to machines, and we kind of feel like zombies, to where we're just sort of existing, and we're not really living. So I think that modern zombie films still fuel a lot of paranoia and modern sort of feelings of dread, and modern sort of wish fulfillment too on both sides, because some people don't want to make any choices. They want to be a zombie.
All right, now you tell me. I'm not going to take that kind of a chance when we got a safe place. We luck into a safe place, and you're telling us we got to risk our lives just because somebody might need help, huh?
Yeah, something like that.
And then on the other side of it, I think I think modern zombie movies are like sort of the reincarnation of the Cowboys and Indians movie, where it's like someone you can like blow away with a shotgun and not feel bad about, because they're not people. You know, and it's like you can be that John Wayne kind of hero with the cowboy bandolier straps and the pistols and the shotguns, and you can just walk out and start blowing your neighbors away because they're not people, and that's how you justify committing that kind of an act.
He's the dead one. Get up here. Nick, Tony, Steve, You want to get out in that field and build me a bonfire.
So I think that's why zombies remain popular today, is because I think that it's romanticized on both sides. You have two very different audiences getting a lot of vicarious thrill out of it.
The zombie initially stemmed from the xenophobia of the Haitian slave uprising, our fear of science embodied in Mary Shelley's immortal creation, the social unrest of the Cold War and Vietnam eras with the EC comics and Romero zombies. We have witnessed the reanimation of a human shell. But what happens to the other part? That soul turned restless after death. You may be able to outrun the undead, but what of the restless spirits of the dead? We will find out next time.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.